Well, it's so great to be speaking today to Matthew Ehret from Montreal, Canada. He's, I would say, one of the top intellectuals in Canada. Certainly, he's done an unbelievable and important work in so many different areas. And he's editor-in-chief of the Canadian Patriot Review, senior fellow at the American University in Moscow. He's the author of The Untold History of Canada book series, which I'd like to see the Untold History of America book series too, I should say, and The Clash of the Two Americas. In 2019, he co-founded the Montreal-based Rising Tide Foundation. So, Matt, great to talk to you, and there are so many things we could discuss, but if you're amenable, how about starting off with what the evil Trudeau did to the truckers and what's happened since then?
Absolutely, Lew. And thank you for having me on and that very generous introduction. I don't know about the top intellectual in Canada, but I try to I try to pursue cutting through bullshit as much as possible. So and making that known. So thank you for that. For as far as Canada is concerned, indeed, yeah, I think it's been a bit of a wake up call the last couple of years, and especially the last 3 or 4 months for a lot of Canadians. In terms of breaking out of the illusion that a lot of people have suffered under, thinking that we were this liberal democracy with a elected official as a head of state. And the lesson of COVID, and especially since the Truckers' Freedom Convoy had emerged at the end of February, is that that's not the case at all. In fact, the reality is that there is a heavy oligarchical structure controlling Canada with a veneer of democratic sort of, lipstick for people on the outside. Trudeau himself is simply, obviously, a bubblehead who doesn't come up with any of the policies he puts into motion. But he's there for a reason, just like his father was, to advance an agenda that comes from something much higher than him. And when you look at things like the Privy Council office that he and every prime minister who becomes a member of the government or the head of the government has to sign an oath of allegiance to Her Majesty the Queen as part of the joining of the Privy Council, as well as keeping oaths secret, people began to realize that there is something above that deals with the fact that we have a real deep state enshrined within our government since the 19th century. And things like the Governor General, being the actual legal head of Canada as the representative of Her Majesty, with lieutenant governors unelected and appointed in each province to exert royal authority over any law that becomes law. Everything has to be given royal assent. So, here we had a real pushback by people who couldn't survive anymore. It's been 2 years of lockdown. People have not been allowed to get on a plane, basically enjoy fundamental freedoms like travel, leaving or entering Canada without being fully jabbed. Even traveling within Canada, you could drive from one province to another, but it's a big country and most people don't have that liberty. You need a car, you need a train, or you need a plane or a train, and you're not allowed to be on these things without being fully jabbed. So it's really been destructive for a lot of businesses, a lot of families who cannot see each other. And and a lot of jobs, have just like in the United States, have been destroyed. A lot of families have broken up. And so there was the Freedom Convoy, which I think was much bigger than many people realized or thought it was going to be. And as an effect, we've all seen the pictures of the freezing of bank accounts, the violent attacks by Canadian forces, people who were deputized and told to go out and crack some heads, which they did, to old ladies being trampled by horses, which eventually did result in that gigantic convoy in Ottawa breaking up. And emergency measures were used to justify that, even though they weren't ultimately passed into law because there was a lot of pushback. I think there was also a bank run danger where people were pulling a lot of their money out of their banks to avoid their accounts being frozen.
That was a great moment, I must say.
Yes, it was. So I think, they realized that they were pushing a little bit too fast, too soon, pulled back on some of the emergency measures. So there's a little bit of a respite right now. The tension has been pulled off so people can, for the most part, in the provinces, sit down in restaurants and what have you. But the federal authorities are still maintaining absolute emergency protocols. There's still no travel permitted if you're not jabbed. And I think that it's just a matter of time before they snap into another lockdown personally. So it's not looking great in that sense.
No, it's scary, of course, and it's we have something similar happening in this country, and we have, of course, our own deep state and all the same evils that Canada has. It's alarming, and it's nasty, and it's vicious, and of course, that's government in my view anyway. But this government really seems to be the U.S. government wants to rule the world. I mean, I think they make no bones about it. And if you don't agree, then you've got to be destroyed. Whether you're Russia or Canada ever said no, they would be destroyed. So it's amazing and awful stuff. Tell me about what you're writing about now. You write wonderful articles, many of which appear on lewrockwell.com. And tell me about what's your interest right now and what you're writing and researching.
Most certainly, yeah. Well, I think part of my ongoing theme that I try to weave in as much as possible into every article I write, and is really this idea that it isn't any particular nation state, as mainstream media tries to often frame our discussion about what is the cause of our geopolitical woes or what have you. It's not that any nation state exists even in a crystallized, finished sense of being devoid of a deep state. There's no pure nation state in the world. There's no nation states making decisions. And ultimately, there is this supranational power above nation states as an authority, which has been there for a very long time. I mean, this is a transgenerational beast, which operates fifth columns. Before the word deep state was popularized, people had formerly utilized the term fifth columns, that operates these things in every single country of the world to varying degrees. And without taking into consideration the understanding of this very centralized supranational oligarchy that has certain modus operandi, certain principled, I won't say principled from the true sense of the word, but it has certain principles that it adheres to, organizational principles, that it must operate under in order to function. Without understanding that, it's really impossible to make sense of a lot of the developments, why wars happen, why economic crises are orchestrated throughout history. And we're given a lot of, explanatory models that don't really get us at causality. They're just designed to sort of give us a sense that, oh yeah, that economic crisis, pick an economic crisis, that happened because of people will often have like a cyclical explanation. There's this 11-year cycle of booms and busts or whatever you want to call it. And there's a whole bunch of different varying reasons depending on whatever ideological bent the narrative is catering to. But overall, most mainstream narratives ignore the existence of an actual oligarchy. So I try to just get that point across, that when you look at what happened to the United States over the past, especially 60 years since the death of John F. Kennedy and his brother, on the surface, a lot of people, especially here in Canada, we tend to be very anti-American as a culture in Canada. That's part of being part of the British, educational system. Coming through it, you kind of are trained to think of America as this intrinsically just evil, rapacious beast. There's a lot of that. It's really weird. Not so much on the West Coast, but it's definitely here on the East Coast.
Is that weird or is it true?
It has a bit of both, like obviously the United States hasn't been on its best behavior since the Kennedys were killed, and there was a plunge into completely these unending wars in Vietnam and Laos and beyond, and so obviously the U.S. hasn't merited much reason to receive praise. But at the same time, the United States population and the nation as a whole has not really benefited by the policies of globalization over the past 50, 60 years either, So it's like the U.S. has created a situation where its whole system, its whole society has self-sabotaged. And then the question is, well, who did benefit? Under whose interests did the last 50 years of Anglo-American imperialism, the rape and destruction of Africa and other poor countries that wanted to have industrial development and whose leaders were promptly assassinated, usually by an Anglo-American coup or some other plot. So there was all of this good that could have happened, and yet it was sabotaged. So who benefited? And that's where you start seeing that, I think, again, one of the key lessons I'm trying to get across in my writings is that it's the same enemies, those same interests that are out to destroy Russia, China, the entire Eurasian alliance, which is developing as an alternative security economic system currently faced with the collapse of the Western order, are the same interests that have been out to destroy the United States for a very long time as well. It's not like It's not like the United States is intrinsically the enemy of China or Russia or other countries. It's that we have this other thing which is taking control, like a Borg, will take control of their victims and try to use them for their own agenda. So that's sort of what I'm doing in all of my articles in varying ways.
Well, it's very important, and of course it has applicability to what's going on in the Ukraine right now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the Ukraine is just the most unfortunate situation. I mean, their physical economic prospects have been so high. If you just go back 30 years, the Ukraine had one of the highest per capita GDP standards, one of the highest quality industrial bases of Eastern Europe. And it was a hub, the Black Sea was a hub for international resorts. Like people would come from all over to vacation there. It was just a really high quality place to live. And in only 30 years, just look at it today. It's at the very bottom of the basket in terms of per capita GDP of European countries. It's been systematically destroyed. And one could say, oh, that was just a series of unfortunate mistakes that happened since 1991 and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And we tried, we really wanted to help Ukraine, and we just made the wrong decisions. And now look at them. Oops. Or you could say that was a systematic intention. And I think that second one is much more reasonable, that there was an agenda to break Ukraine economically, such that the population, there wasn't a big support base for neo-Nazi romanticism of the Banderites, who've become national heroes in recent years, and other Azov and other, fascist military groups that glorify the fascist participation of Nazi collaborators like Mykola Lebed and others during World War II that carried out mass exterminations, not just of Jews, but also of Slavs, of Poles, all of the inferior Untermenschen. That was not a big thing. If you look in the 1970s, 1980s in Ukraine, that was not a big dynamic. And under the conditions, I think, of economic despair, the mass creation of an oligarchy that was arranged under the watch of people like Bill Clinton, Strobe Talbot, who was in charge of much of this perestroika operation, Victoria Nuland, Strobe Talbot's personal assistant in the 1990s, and a lot of George Soros money that obviously all works together to get a certain effect, and that integrated these countries increasingly into NATO, that had been part of the Warsaw Pact. The Balkanization of Yugoslavia, obviously, which is an illegal war carried out by NATO, and the encirclement of Russia and China by this ballistic missile shield. This has been something which resulted, when you just look at the destruction of economic opportunities, in despair and the radicalization of more and more people, which is, I think, at the heart also of many of the problems that are underlying the fires currently raging in Ukraine today, since especially Russia has been forced to respond to the threat not only of Ukraine joining Russia, but Ukraine also hosting nuclear missiles, as Zelensky had called for, on February 19th, a week before the Japanese Prime Minister, or former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who also glorifies, by the way, World War II Nazi collaborators of Japan. He even called for acquiring nuclear weapons controlled by the United States to protect themselves against rapacious China, and also called for the U.S. supporting Taiwan militarily in the advent of China behaving like Russia and taking the Pacific Ukraine, aka Taiwan, which is legally part of China anyway, but people are not supposed to think about that. So it's the exact same game plan being deployed on both sides of the world right now, and it's not very creative, but it is very dangerous.
No, it's horrifying. In fact, how many of the good guy intellectuals in Canada actually understand this? For example.
Oh, the understanding is quite low. There's a very low level of literacy in terms of how to think about. People will often compartmentalize geopolitics from history, from economics, and so people will often have some interesting things to say about one of their fields of specialty, which is the same case for Europe and the United States as well. I think compartmentalization is really the death of understanding if it's done too unnaturally. Because you specialization, I think, is fine, but you don't want to have a specialized myopic focus at the expense of the big picture. And that's I think, the big problem, the big mental handicap that's been put into our zeitgeist, is that people cannot see what the whole is. They can just focus on their particular niche, So it creates a situation where most people are instruments of something that they don't even understand. They're highly specialized to fit into as a cog into a machine, into their department, into their bureaucratic whatever structure, and they don't know what they're doing. Whether they're working for intelligence, whether they're working for the World Bank or IMF. I think that 99.8% of the people operational within these institutions are not fully aware. They're not bad people. They don't go to bed thinking, okay, we destroyed a country today. Great, But you just need to have with this type of system in place, you only need a small little executive grouping within a nerve center that can see what the whole is and that can nudge and move the system in a certain direction. So there's this awful idea of conspiracy theories that comes from, I think, Hollywood movies like Fight Club, where there's this fallacious idea that just everybody is in on it. And it's not like that. So today, I think if you do look at the interactivity of the economic systems, of the political agendas that transcend individual lifetimes, there are these higher continuous functions. And you look at the geopolitical system, they're all just different sides of the same story. And when you start realizing that, then you could start, I think, and people's bell curve increases dramatically. Their density of discoveries that they can make by cutting through the bullshit of popular narratives that are all lies, mostly all lies, placed to deflect our attention from discovering a truth. That happens really fast. But they have to that first discovery is a tough one, to think about how does the economic crisis, the control of the banking system, the ideologies of banking tie into the geopolitical controls of minerals, resources, nations, and other things that are more in the domain of geopolitics.
Matt, how concerned should we be about the Great Reset?
That's a no-brainer, right? I think for anybody who's been listening to you, Lew, they're probably already quite concerned, as they should be. But I think that rather than, I get a lot of emails from people who are kind of bad tripping, like flipping out, because it is bad, and you look at the intention is pretty clear of depopulation, that there is certain computer models that have been operational, especially since the early 70s, produced by people, organizations like the Club of Rome, that have tried to justify that there is this absolute cap on population based on what input we put into our computer models that define resources and certain technologies that exist at a current state that allow for certain maintenance of people at a certain level of quality of life. And these computer models, I think there's a certain consensus are that we can sustainably in equilibrium of some homeostatic view of nature, maybe 1 billion, maybe 2 billion human lives, which is far lower than the current nearly 8 billion or more that currently exist. So the Great Reset, from a simple standpoint, it's really just an excuse, a label that was created in the wake of this pandemic to justify a complete behavioral modification and a set of new values to be imposed onto the world system as a way to justify or get the victims of this depopulation agenda to acquiesce or even desire their own destruction, by having us be convinced as people that the great faults of the world's ills, climate change, pandemics, this is all just that we consume too much. There's too many of us. We allow too many cows to exist and too much wheat production, which is the current Canadian government just produced a report actually saying that the Canadian farmers that produce wheat mostly, but all Canadian farmers are the highest carbon dioxide emitting producers of farming, at least in the world, is somehow what they've tried to maintain in this fact. There's no facts actually backing up any of the claims in this report, but the argument is being made that we have to solve the problem by essentially shutting down those causes of utilizing fertilizers, utilizing different, bad chemicals and bad emissions that contribute to global warming, which frankly, there is no global warming happening from a scientific standpoint. Anybody actually who are looking at the real parameters of what causes climate change to happen historically, I'll just say this as a segue. They know that it's primarily being driven by astroclimatological issues, the sun, the electromagnetic field of the Earth that moderates the amount of cosmic rays coming in to our Earth and seeding clouds, which if, you think about what causes the heating and cooling in short or longer term cycles, it's things like this. It's having more or fewer clouds. When you have more cosmic rays, you get more low level cloud coverage, you get more cooling. And if this continues in time too long, you can tend to get an ice age whereby you lose a lot of life, which is sort of what it seems we're heading into right now at the end of a 10,000 year Holocene warming period, which is currently what we're living through right now is not global warming, but actually the opposite, the emergence of a new, whether it's a small or a longer ice age, we still are not sure, but that's really what we should be thinking about. And instead, people are looking at these computer models with all of their projections of like how much we're going to burn the Earth in the next 30 or 40 years, which they've been saying now since the 70s. They've always been wrong. And trying to shut down food production in Britain as well, right? Under the Great Reset ideology, they've just put online, Boris Johnson, a program to give financial incentives to farmers to quit farming. Just, we'll give you one bulk chunk of money. Just sell your farm, get out of farming, retire. We'll make it lucrative for you. They're paying farmers across the United States to destroy their crops. There's montage videos of hundreds of farmers all across the U.S. basically filming themselves crying, saying, I have to destroy my food. They're even paying them 1.5 times more than market value for their crops, not for their food to be eaten, but just for them to take, just to destroy them, right? And they're being told, I don't want to do this. But they're being threatened with having insurance withheld the following planting season if they don't do it. So there's a real artificial intention right now to create scarcity on top of the economic crisis, which is, our financial system was designed to blow out. I think when you just look at what put this thing into motion back in the early 70s, we had a formerly viable industrial capitalist economic system that was transformed into a speculative basket case under the floating of the dollar, right, off of the fixed exchange rate gold standard, and into the floating markets, and then tied to the price of oil on the spot markets and futures. So that whole thing that Kissinger and the Trilateral Commission orchestrated, when they were the same people who were, these are the same networks that were creating the World Economic Forum in 1971. Klaus Schwab was Kissinger's personal student, so he was also the prodigy of Maurice Strong. And Maurice Strong, I think everybody listening probably knows this sociopathic Canadian, was a co-founder of that World Economic Forum as well. These were the institute. They wanted to take a viable economic order that was premised on, industrial capital, like a capitalism that was based upon the creation of capital, not just speculating on increasing rates of debts. And they turned it into a time bomb based on myopic, maximization of profits in the moment without thinking about the longer term consequences of your decisions economically, and creating a situation where we have today, the biggest cartelization of corporations above nation states, and a bubble of, what is it? I don't even know, Lou. What do we have for derivatives built into the system at this point? I don't know if this can be calculated, but it's way more than the GDP by a factor of like 10 or 20.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, this is the Great Reset. It's really an idea of going back to feudalism. It's a technocratic feudalism, and I think that I would be a lot more depressed if I were just looking at the transatlantic community here in our part of the Titanic, But if I look globally at the process, I have a lot more hope, because they're actually, for the first time in world history, as far as I could see, a coalition of different ancient cultures, civilizational forces in Eurasia, which have basically decided not to commit a collective suicide as they were expected to. So I'm happy that there is actually a sort of a real genuine resistance that I can identify, saying no to the depopulation, no to the shutdown of their industrial base, and no to this permanent war. Because this whole system, ultimately it talks about Agenda 2030 and the Green New Deal crap, the Great Reset Initiative. All of these things are parts of the same thing, and they all use this nice flowery language of world peace, and we're going to have a world of stability and all. It's not. That's just. It's like what they did to Ukraine, or Russia. Just dissolve the Soviet Union, and you're going to have this great capitalist world of cooperation and win-win. No, it was always a lie. You're right. Privatizing their entire former Soviet space, the way that it was done, was always designed to destroy the people, destroy the nations, and subdue them under a one world government. That was always the agenda. And that's the same thing today. And it requires ongoing infinite wars that will never end, the balkanization of everybody into smaller and smaller compartments, right? Just like what they did to Yugoslavia, or what Zbigniew Brzezinski talked about when you look at his grand chessboard he wrote in 1997. He had a map of like a hyper balkanized Russian Federation that was broken up into something like 12 microstates, or they have the same designs. There's maps that have been put forward by think tanks over the years for China to break them up into like 7 little tiny divided like little mini ethnic nationalist groups that would all be under the control of the IMF, the World Bank. And so the Great Reset is really infinite war that would basically be the fate of most of the world, and starvation. It would be a painful thing. And so again, the Eurasian economic system, especially with Sergei Glaziev, the advisor to the Russian Federation, who's a leading figure, who's currently being brought back into play right now in the last couple of weeks. He's been calling for and putting online an actual program for a Eurasian Economic Union, China, new financial system premised on completely different paradigm of economics, and also just activity, like the idea of emitting long-term credit for the development of the Arctic, of Siberia, which Putin has said again is still a national priority despite the economic sanctions and attacks against the ruble. The development and extension of high-speed rail and other things into opening up the underdeveloped Siberian and northern regions, which is tied to the Polar Silk Road, which is another branch. People, I think, all know this, but China's Belt and Road Initiative has also the name New Silk Road, which has a polar extension, which has really taken hold, especially since 2019. It's a big part of my new book. And so all of these things are really integrating into this holistic resistance, which is all premised on anti-depopulation, anti-destruction of nation states. And instead, what we're seeing for the 140 countries, at least, that have signed agreements to join to varying degrees the Belt and Road Initiative. 140, that's significant. What we're seeing is something very different from the IMF World Bank sort of practice towards Africa or other poor countries over the past 70 years. And instead, what we're seeing are loans not tied to conditionalities, but that are rather tied to the specific building of giant projects, whether it's in Ethiopia or Kenya or Sudan or other neighboring countries in Asia or Russia. So it's a matter of getting things done that is creating a blossoming of private enterprise of, it's not just this, it's often characterized by mainstream media, as this replay of, the old crusty communist order of authoritarian nation states that don't believe in private capital versus the liberal democratic societies that believe in freedom. No, it's actually not that at all. So there's something else going on, which again gives me some hope, because this is a different type. We will get a new system. That's a guarantee. The question is whether it's going to be operating on which principle, right? And these other leaders of Eurasia, they're representing, again, ancient civilizational forces. Their idea right now is that we need an open, not a closed system. The Great Reset idea is very much premised on the mathematical idea of a closed computer model. There's nothing you can introduce that's not within the parameters of the system of the programmer, right, running the computer models. Whereas in an open system, which is, I think, more in harmony with how the universe actually works, there's always new place for creative ideas, new discoveries that haven't been made, that are not in the old model, which is that's really, I think, the fundamental lesson of economics, which is, we have to really make that breakthrough fast, though, because if we still think that we're just a little hedonistic machine inside of a computer system, and that's like our nature, we're not going to be able to argue against people like George Soros and others who are trying to convince us that this is really our fate, right? Is just to accept that we've overshot our consumption. We have to now think little, think small, think depopulated, expect to kill grandma if she's too expensive to maintain, unfortunately, right? That's the new paradigm. The cost benefit ratio doesn't justify keeping old people alive if they're not useful anymore. So you got to, again, it's this Nazi ethic coming back online, which we have to be able to refute.
Matthew, thanks for giving us some hope. And how about telling us at the end here, tell us about your new book.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Well, yeah, it's volume 3 of the trilogy. So I'm closing up this trilogy that began with volume 1 of The Clash of the Two Americas. Volume 1 had it dealt with 1774 with the Quebec Act, which kept sort of Quebec here where I'm located. That was all of Canada back then. It kept us out of the American Revolution where we were supposed to. We had a lot of Ben Franklin was up here in Montreal for several weeks, right in April 1776. And he had been really trying hard to organize a delegation from Canada to be a part of the other 13 colonies, to say as 14 colonies, we're going to create this new type of system outside of the British Empire, and we failed. The Quebec Act was one of the bribes that kept us under the control of the Crown. That was a screw up. So anyway, that's where that story kicks off in volume 1, and it proceeds all the way through the assassinations of all of the leaders, the different American presidents of the 19th century up until McKinley was killed in 1901. And I'm just trying to I try to very concisely get across the common threads, the common themes of what each one of these presidents, from Harrison in 1840 to Zachary Taylor in 1851 to Lincoln, obviously, and then Garfield and then McKinley. What's the common thread that they were all activating? What were the common interests at different times that they were attacking this Wall Street fifth column parasite embedded as a part of this British Empire within the United States, this deep state? They were all doing battle with this cancer inside of the U.S. So I tried to tell that story in volume 1. Volume 2 picks up from 1890 until the present, with this the title of The Open versus Closed Systems Collide, with a picture of Zbigniew Brzezinski on the one side with a big explosion behind him, and then a painting of JFK counterposing him, just to get across again the 20th century dynamic of how the U.S. was subverted by this same thing that killed Harrison, Zachary Taylor, Lincoln, and McKinley. And then it focuses on the rise of the, I try to spend the last few chapters just painting, fleshing out what is this open system that's reemerging that the U.S. once was, but now is being represented by the leadership of Russia, China, and others in the Eurasian zone. And then currently now the third volume that was just finally made available today, it's about 400 pages, is on the birth of a Eurasian manifest destiny. So how the old, typically American idea of the Monroe Doctrine, the manifest destiny doctrine, at least the better variant of it, because there's a few destructive variants of the manifest destiny idea that justify a Pax Americana, but there's actually a good, healthy version as well. How that's being revived in Eurasia currently, with a lot of history. There's a lot of context in there, and I've got several chapters just fleshing out the deep state fifth columns in China as well as in Russia, so that Westerners can better appreciate what the hell is going on, in these countries that we often tend to label with one good or evil paintbrush, and we miss the nuance. So that's something people can buy either on my website, on CanadianPatriot.org. It's an easy way to find it. There's all sorts of little buttons saying buy the books. Or if they want a PDF, they could just write to me at info@risingtidefoundation.net. I could send them a PDF for free if money is scarce. I understand. Otherwise, that's the best thing to do.
Matt, this has been tremendous, and I can see why you're so well thought of in Canada and other parts of this world. So thanks so much for coming on the show. I hope you come back. I'd like to have your wife on at some point too.
Cynthia would love to be on. She loves your website, and absolutely, yeah. I would. I'm looking forward to our next conversation.
Terrific. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Lew. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, thanks so much for listening to the Lew Rockwell Show today. Take a look at all the podcasts. There have been hundreds of them. There's a link on the LRC front page. Thank you.